1 hour before dawn, December the 7th, 1941, Central Pacific Ocean. A single aircraft sat on the flight deck of the Imperial Japanese aircraft carrier Soryu, its engine warming up as the flight deck crew prepared their charge for launch. Lieutenant Commander Takaki scanned his instruments, gave a grunt of satisfaction as all appeared to be in order. His attention then switched to the deck crew, busily fussing around his aircraft. He saw the signal and acknowledged the instruction to increase his engine revolutions. The aircraft vibrated as the motor increased to full power. The batsman, with his red torch, spanned the light in a wide circular movement before finally pointing to the ship's bow. Takaki released the brakes and his Zero fighter shot forward along the flight deck. Once airborne, he raised the undercarriage and began to climb. Satisfied all was well, he turned the aircraft to port, settling on a heading of 090 degrees. The eastern horizon was already losing its inky blackness as Takaki headed for it, an amber glow from the still-to-rise sun pushing back the darkness. The same moment, but 6 hours time difference, Tokyo, Japan. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Imperial Japanese Combined Fleet, sat behind a large impressive desk in his office at Fleet Headquarters. It was just past midnight as he sipped on his umpteenth cup of coffee. He had acquired a taste for the bean while serving as the naval attaché in Washington, and now drank it to the exclusion of all other beverages, even the Japanese staple of tea. He massaged his temples with the thumb and middle finger of his left hand. He was tired, but unlike the other residents of Tokyo, he would not be settling down for a good night's sleep. He knew the scouting mission to Pearl Harbor would now be in the air. The information the pilot brought back would decide the next moves. He had impressed upon the Emperor and Minister of War Tojo that knocking out the US Pacific Fleet was absolutely key to future operations. He could run wild for 6 months, but after that could promise nothing. But only if one or more of the American carriers could be destroyed. Many admirals, including most of the older generation, brought up with the big guns, heavily armoured battleships, refused to believe or acknowledge that the battle wagon was no longer queen of the ocean. She had been usurped by the flat top with her powerful long-reaching air wing. The former queen would find herself demoted to a mere handmaiden, subservient to the new ruler of the ocean. He had instructed Vice Admiral Nagumo, commander of the strike fleet, that the attack on Pearl Harbor would only proceed if one or more of the American carriers was in the harbour. It had raised eyebrows, as he knew it would, but it would be the American carriers who would bring the fight to Japan, not the battleships. He lifted his cup to his lips, inhaling the wonderful aroma. It would be the last moments of solitude he would enjoy for some time. Vice Admiral Ozawa, commander of the initial Philippine invasion force, stood on the bridge of his flagship, the battleship Haruna. The force with its invasion transports had quietly left Okinawa and proceeded south, staying well away from the western coast of the Philippines. His ships would provide shore bombardment for the troops landing south of Manila. That was his orders, to take the central area, deny the port and the airfield to the enemy until reinforcements arrived. The Yamato strike force would provide the needed troops and equipment to capture the remainder of the island. It was heading south at that very moment. Rear Admiral Takagi had sailed from Saipan and was tasked with taking Wake Island. If the planned raid on Pearl Harbor was aborted, he could expect air support from Nagumo's carriers. If not, They was to press on regardless, though victory would be far from assured. The Lone Zero approached Pearl Harbor. It was a beautiful, clear morning, and Lieutenant Commander Takaki was flying at maximum height to avoid being observed. American big band music was being broadcast by Radio Honolulu, and it appeared the Americans were totally unaware of the Japanese strike force close to the islands. He switched on his reconnaissance camera as he passed over the harbour. He could see the battleships on Battleship Row, moored in their customary pairs. There were plenty of other vessels too, but no carriers. When the strike force left Japan 11 days ago, spies had reported both the Enterprise and Lexington were at their usual berths. He scanned out to the horizon in every direction in the hope of spotting a departing or arriving flat top. He cursed, and keeping a watchful eye on his fuel gauge, decided to head further east towards Maui and if possible Hawaii itself, in the hope of spotting the elusive carriers. Thousands of feet below, Seaman First Class Emmanuel Puccini was making his way to the head aboard the USS Arizona. It had been a heavy night of drinking ashore last night, and his bladder was in desperate need of release. His mouth felt like a desert, and the beginnings of what he knew would be one hell of a hangover was already starting to pummel his brain. He reached the head and felt the instant relief as his bladder discharged its load. At least he would get a few more hours of shut-eye before having to turn to later. Frustrated, Lieutenant Commander Takawa banked his Zero in a turn and headed back to the Soryu. He would report in person to Vice Admiral Nagumo that no carriers were at Pearl. His film would back that up. Emmanuel Puccini would suffer a horrendous hangover all that day. He did not know it, but he was lucky, for today was not his day to die.